Dear brothers and sisters, today we are going to explore a frequently misunderstood question. Can Christians use force? Some people point to Jesus' words in Matthew 26 verse 52, "All who draw the sword will die by the sword," to argue that Christians must reject all forms of violence or force. But in Luke 22 verse 36, Jesus also says, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." What did he mean by that? Did Jesus contradict himself, or have we misunderstood his message? Let's look at this carefully and consider, is there a place for using some level of force, especially to protect others, in the Christian life? 1. Jesus stops Peter, but why? Matthew 26 verse 52. When Jesus was arrested at Gethsemane, Peter drew a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus responded, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." At first glance, this seems like a rejection of all violence. But the deeper context shows that Jesus was focused on fulfilling the Father's will at that moment, not on establishing a rule against all use of force. Peter was not acting to protect the innocent. He was emotionally resisting God's plan. Jesus' response was about obedience to the Father, not a blanket ban on protective action. 2. By a sword, why would Jesus say that? Luke 22 verse 36. Just before his arrest, Jesus told his disciples, "But now, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." This statement surprises many. If Jesus opposed violence, why tell his followers to arm themselves? Some scholars believe Jesus was speaking symbolically, preparing his disciples to face hostility and hardship. Others argue that he was telling them to be realistically prepared, not to attack others, but for basic self-defense, since they would no longer have public support or protection. Either way, the message seems to allow for a degree of preparedness, not out of aggression, but out of wisdom. 3. Love means laying down your life, Ephesians 5 verse 25. Paul writes, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." This verse strongly supports the idea you raised. Love includes sacrifice and protection. If someone threatens your wife, children, or neighbor, and you have the ability to stop it, standing by passively would violate the command to love your neighbor as yourself. Laying down your life, like Christ did, is not passive surrender, it is active, selfless love. Sometimes, protecting someone may involve courage, and even some force, not for revenge, but for their good. 4. Government bears the sword, Romans 13 verse 4. Paul says of the governing authority, "For he is God's servant to do you good. He does not bear the sword for nothing." This reminds us that force itself is not inherently evil. God has ordained certain roles, such as government, to restrain evil and protect the innocent. The sword is not a symbol of cruelty, but of justice. So while Christians are not called to vengeance, restraining evil and protecting others may sometimes involve action, even force used responsibly. 5. The Good Samaritan and love your neighbor. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus shows us that the true neighbor is the one who steps in to help the victim. Imagine if the Samaritan had arrived while the robbers were still attacking. Would loving your neighbor mean walking away? Of course not. It would mean intervening to protect. Sometimes loving your neighbor may involve stepping into danger, not for retaliation, but to save a life. Conclusion: not passive pacifists, but active peacemakers. Christians are not to be driven by revenge or hatred. But neither are we called to be passive in the face of evil. We are to be active peacemakers, willing to lay down our lives for others, and at times, to protect them. As a husband might be called to die for his wife, he may also be called to defend her. And that principle can extend to protecting one's family, neighbor, or even a stranger in danger. This is not against the teaching of Jesus, it may in fact be the true fulfillment of Christ-like love. Dear brothers and sisters, let us rethink the question. Does true love sometimes mean standing up for others, even if it costs us something? If God calls us to lay down our lives, does that not include the courage to defend others from harm? May we become loving, wise, and courageous disciples of Christ, not fighting for power or pride, but willing to act in love and sacrifice when it truly matters.